This last week has seen a varied response to the Syrian refugee crisis in the wake of the Paris attacks. Individuals, groups, and religious organizations fundraising to sponsor families, governments stepping up to the plate, but also the social and political backlash, including a spate of hate-motivated crimes against Muslims. Many argue that now, more than ever, we need to uphold the ideals of diversity. And yet that very term, diversity, has come under some scrutiny lately. Some critics are calling it empty, a word that may pay lip service to equality and tolerance without the necessary action. Some are saying that the term may be even doing more harm than good. Does language matter? In a few minutes, we're going to hear from a writer and an arts and culture academic on the semantics here. But first, let's hear from Amira Elghawaby. She is the communications director at the National Council of Canadian Muslims, and she is in Ottawa today. Hello there.
Hi, Jill.
In Ontario alone, since the Paris attacks, we've seen Muslims told in, graffiti and in words to go back home. We've seen mosques vandalized, a fire set, a mother beaten and called a terrorist in front of her children's school. Before we get to the question of the term diversity, I want to ask you how you're feeling after what has been, can't have been an easy week.
Well, I think it has been a very difficult week for so many different reasons. As you say, there has definitely been, unfortunately, a spate of incidents targeting either Canadian Muslim institutions or Canadian Muslims, as you mentioned, a mother who was beaten up on her way to school. And then have been other reports of both men and women, visibly who are Muslim, being harassed and almost threatened in some cases. And these are very difficult to deal with, particularly, of course, after the terrible incident in Paris and what was going on there. So certainly all of this comes very difficult for the community because many of us want to feel very safe. For example, I grew up here in Ottawa. This is my hood, as I say. And it's very difficult to imagine that there are people out there who may act out on fear and ignorance, blaming, people for doing something, for not having anything to do with what happened, what we see on our television screens and read in our papers. So it's been hard.
Do you see those incidents as are those outliers, those people? Because there's a lot of Canadians for whom being part of and celebrating a multicultural country is a real point of pride. And we are seeing a lot of more positive reactions from the broader community. So how do you balance those two?
Well, I think absolutely it's all about balancing, and I think for sure the amount of outpouring that we have seen from Canadians right across the country towards Canadian Muslims has been, definitely inspirational and heartwarming, and what we would expect living in Canada that has, historically tried, it's not perfect, but has tried to speak about inclusion and diversity, and we're going to get to that, I guess, in a minute. But I think that we definitely have to reinforce that and understand that anyone who would act out their hatreds on others and vandalize or hurt or be aggressive in this way, that these are definitely a minority, and hopefully the authorities will apprehend them and charge them and convict them to send a message that sort of behavior isn't acceptable. But definitely as Canadians, we have to come together and continuously challenge and counter hatred wherever we see it, whether it's in online social media, whether it's with our friends just chatting together and maybe someone cracks a joke. I think it's important that Islamophobia is on the same level as any kind of racism, any kind of anti-Semitism, homophobia, all of these, it's all together. So just as we wouldn't accept to hear someone, speaking negatively about any group at all, the same must be true for Muslims. And I think that's really important, particularly in a very charged political climate that we're living in, and being very aware of the global climate that we're living in too.
We're talking about the term diversity today and how it gets used. And I want to know your take. What do you think of that term?
Well, first of all, I think it's always wonderful when we do have an opportunity to talk about the terms we use and think about them very critically. I think that's really important. But on a practical level, the term diversity is a very quick way to speak to the need for different voices, different perspectives, different backgrounds to be sitting around tables, to be in decision-making positions, to be reflected in our popular media. It's a way, it's a way to quickly address the point that sometimes we assume that we're hearing from everyone we need to be hearing from, but we need to question that and to look around and say, are there voices that are missing from a conversation, or are there people that should be here that we are speaking to or serving, who would have some input to offer, who we're not reaching out to and we're not listening to? So I think diversity, it's a quick way to start the conversation, but it's not the end of the conversation.
Is it strategic? Is the use of that word sort of strategic to avoid stronger terms? I mean, like racism or Islamophobia.
Well, I mean, I think diversity is a positive way to address, sometimes the lack of access, the barriers to access, stigmatization, marginalization. It's a positive way to bring that conversation, which is sometimes a difficult conversation for people to have. And so it's a positive way, but certainly if it's not coupled with actual action and action items, whether we have to think about anti-discrimination policies, whether we have to, name Islamophobia for what it is, that all has to happen as well.
Mm-hmm. But generally,
you have to
the
start
term,
somewhere.
The term, so you don't have cynicism around the term when people talk about celebrating diversity, but not talking about inequality.
We have to talk about inequality, for sure. And certainly we've definitely seen more of a move towards talking about equity, for example, or inclusion, cohesion. So all of these terms, I think, have to be used, depending also on the context. So, for example, I give presentations to students in classrooms, and I talk about diversity on television shows, or in their viral videos that they're sharing. Who's speaking? Who are you listening to? Whose stories are being told? Is it does it reflect the diversity around you, the different backgrounds, the different people that you see? And so that's again a quick way to be able to say, look around and see how are you or not, how are you or how are you not being reflected in the institutions around you, the corporations, the popular media, etc. So I think we can become cynical if it stops there.
Right.
If it stops there and there aren't further conversations and we're not talking further about it, and that's where the cynicism would come in. Mm-hmm. But definitely, I do believe it's a good starting place.
So good to get your thoughts. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks so much, Jill.
That was Amira Elghawaby from the National Council of Canadian Muslims. We